I always have the anticipatory anxiety gets in my way.
Alright, so I think
It's been a long time because I used to do a lot of talks.
Yeah.
it's quarter after, so in the interest of trying to, keep on schedule, I think we should just at least introduce ourselves. If people come in late, then, or they're not here, we're going to get going, kind of with or without. So you all know me. As you know, this session is going to be about human subjects in community research. So we have Maria Palazuelos from the University of Delaware's IRB, and we have Bob Colness, who works at Nemours IRB. And, so they're very much, the experts and are going to, help us both put the big picture in perspective for the work that we will do in our careers, but also they've seen at least the initial versions of your projects and have some idea specifically to kind of, discuss those with you. So I'll let you.
Hi, I'm Liz O'Neill, and I work in family and community medicine on the community health side with a focus on women's and children's health.
I'm Brian Raymond. I work with Liz and Heather as well in the Department of Family and Community Medicine here at Christiana, and I am a co-director for community engagement and health services research for the ACEAWARDS.
I'm Mike McKenzie. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Delaware in the Department of Behavioral Health and Nutrition, and my area of interest is in physical activity and cancer care.
Sean Hubble, I'm the program director of the Cancer Support Community, and I'm an oncology social worker. My main interest is providing emotional support to folks with cancer.
Veda Owens-White, Delaware Regional Health Ministry Network, and what else?
She's got lots of hats.
And I'm interested in childhood obesity.
Hi, Kristen Isaac, research assistant. Still Kristen, research assistant with the Excel grant.
Please.
Well, as Heather said, I'm Maria Palazuelos. I've been at the University of Delaware for 3 years now, so I'm fairly new there. I'm director of research compliance, so the non-financial side of compliance, and my office oversees the IRB operation mainly, as well as other aspects of compliance like conflict of interest and responsible conduct of research training and things that researchers need to conduct the research besides the ushering of their money and funds. So, it's been an exciting time actually, and I'm looking forward. This grant has put, I think, a stress on UD as far as going beyond our comfort zone. As you know, we don't have a medical school, but luckily we have strong collaborators in the medical world. So we're all looking forward to the path forward, and hopefully we can be of assistance. As I was talking to him, we hope our process is easy enough to navigate, and we're very short-handed at UD in our IRB office, but we're always willing to help our researchers and others that are collaborating with them to get their projects moving. So.
I'm Bob Colness. I work at Nemours. I started there, it'll be 10 years in April. I started with Nemours Health and Prevention Services, and then slowly but surely got more and more involved with the Office of Human Subjects Protection. I didn't see that coming. I was sort of recruited. Part of the reason why is because I have a true passion for it. I realize I was an investigator. So when Brian was at Nemours Health and Prevention Services way back when, I was pretty much the only PI on any of the evaluation projects that were ongoing. So it was always my name on top. I was responsible. So finally we got more people engaged, but it got a little scary there at the beginning because I was constantly getting questions from the Institutional Review Board about the work we were doing with Nemours Health and Prevention Services because it was new to Nemours. It was a whole new division. Plus, I have skin in this game. I have a passion for it. I know Steve's not here yet, but I have an autistic child. I don't know how anybody has signed an informed consent to participate in research. Just give me an idea. How many is signed on behalf of the child who couldn't assent for themselves? it's a whole different ballgame. Because of my history and the background of my family, as Liz pointed out, you literally have blood in the game. We did DNA testing. We participated in research at CHOP. We had IQ testing, and not just for my son, but for our whole family, including grandparents. So, and constantly, because of the interest in autism research, we're constantly getting requests to participate in more research. And there are times I've turned it down. I've read the consent forms, and I thought they were so poorly crafted and so open-ended that in good conscience, I could not do that. So when I say that to some people, and I'm not saying anybody in this room, they think of IRB, they think of, ugh, bureaucracy. And it may feel that way, but in fact, there's a face behind it. So when I think of IRB, I think of, and I work for a pediatric institution, so it's a very specific group. And if you're doing research with kids, and a lot of times they're kids who can't speak for themselves, that's who we try to speak for. So yes, we are a pain. We can be your best friend as part of an IRB, or we can be your worst nightmare, especially if you're looking at us as just a hurdle to get over. And you don't realize and you don't think about what is it that people are consenting to do? What are the limits of that consent? So for me, I'm very passionate about this work, and that's sort of how I got engaged in it. And I'm hoping today Maria and I can sort of give you some of that passion and some understanding based on the work that you all are trying to do. Try to help you overcome what you might see as not just a hurdle, but something that's really important that needs to be considered as you go out and do really good work. That's one thing I've always noticed as I'm doing research myself, or as I'm reading proposals from scientists. They all mean well, almost in all cases, at least for myself so far. But at the same time, are they explaining it to a way that a participant can understand it? Or are they so caught up in their own verbiage, their own language? Do people really understand what they're getting into? So we'll get more into the informed consent and how to write that in a little bit. But anyways, that's my background. So that sort of gives you the foundation of me, of who I am.
Good. Let's see if this works.
Yes.
Here, hold on.
I think they're right.
Maybe I have to point this way.
I can do it.
I mean, I don't mind standing out behind there too.
So Maria and I are going to tag team you all. We got a bunch of slides. Some of them you have seen before because you're all engaged in some level. This is one I picked out, I found, because it says, but if not participatory action research, what is it? Well, it's sort of the classic model of what research has always been that we talk about. It's dictatorial inaction research. Oh, we're going to observe. We're going to observe. We're not really going to do anything, but we're just going to observe. And then we're going to write it up and, publish it. Go ahead. Go to the next one. Keep going. Let's go to something interesting. You know who we are. Everybody here knows why we're doing translational research at this point. This is sort of redundant. But the important thing from that slide is the community engaged part. Let's go one more. I want to go to, yes, thank you. Traditional research, community-placed research, community-based research, community-based participatory research. So we have a spectrum, right, on how we look at research. We have our tradition, which is how we do things, which is the academic model. Our two funded studies right now are going to the University of Delaware, going through a very well-established academic system where it's publish or perish for the most part. And you guys live that life every day. I got bad news for you, though. When you get to the community, they don't care. As a parent, I don't care. I feel your pain, but when it comes down to it, the traditional model in a community environment, not so interested, which is why we love the idea of this community engaged or community participatory, or if Steve were here, I'd stick my finger at him and say community driven, because his work has really been driven by external forces to work with special needs populations, which I happen to be part of. So anyways, So that gives you an idea of that spectrum. It's an applied collaborative approach, and what we really want to see here, and everybody met Carolyn Jenkins, I think, at the meeting, and what I loved about what Carolyn did is she walked around and she talked about ways of really becoming more, there he is. Hey, Steve. Really, yes. She really talked about ways of getting the community more involved in some of the posters as far as becoming either part of study teams or how community can become more closely engaged with the work. Everybody know Steve? So I was picking on him, Steve, saying that before we had a slide up that showed the continuum, and yours is community driven. It's external forces pushing you.
That's right.
As opposed to some that are thinking we're just going to become collaborative with the community, coming from the academic perspective, and then collaborate together and do something. Now you have the external pushing in, and we're seeing more of that. There's an AIDS project that was up in Massachusetts that was excellent that I saw at a conference, and this foundation went to the University of Massachusetts and said, HIV folks in this area, this geographical area need help. And we need to understand what it is they need so we can do a better job of supporting them. They drove the University of Massachusetts to become engaged. So it's very similar to what you're doing with special needs populations and the YRBS. Please. Okay, so again, here's the continuum. We have outreach, we have consult, we have involve. Involve's nice, but it's not quite where I think the real money is. And we have shared leadership and participatory, and then we have community driven. And everybody is on that continuum somewhere. For the most part, I don't think we have anything that's just outreach that I've seen. I think we're all further down in the community and we're doing. Now, you're probably all saying this is redundant, but what's interesting, or what I hope you'll find interesting, is this is something that you have to consider, your perspective, the community's perspective, as you figure out how you're going to submit your protocols for IRB review. Because there's things you need to remember. In that institutional review board, you have not only people who are academics like yourself, practitioners like yourself, you also have community representation like yourself. And they're all going to be reading your proposal from a different perspective. And I think...
And maybe one of the challenges in this world is that, at least in the academic environment, and I think traditionally, the regulations behind the protection of human subjects in research are very much focused on a traditional model of research with individuals, and they don't necessarily cover as well the community aspect of it. So I think we're all new to it, and we'll face challenges as these projects come in to our boards to interpret them correctly and understand them without putting the constraints that we are used to apply when it's traditional research. And what I mean with that is that an IRB is going to expect details. We need details in order to approve a protocol. We can't just have loose ends and good hopes, and this is how I plan to do it, and I'll have conversations with such and such. So I think there's going to be a legwork that needs to be done ahead of the protocol itself as to define those interactions with the community, what they mean, what they are going to translate into, and if you have them engaged in defining the project, obviously those conversations have to start early enough without crossing the border where potentially they're also subjects and you engage them in a project that is not approved yet, right?
I mean, I think that's one of our challenges is the needs assessment. Those conversations are the research, right? So it's hard to, I mean, and if you're going with like a really community-driven approach, you're not going in with a lot of information for fear that it is that you're sort of dictating to the community.
Right. And what's the role?
Yeah.
Each community member might have a role, and you need to figure that out, and the IRB is going to want to know what that is.
Sure.
Because depending on that role, they might need a certain level of training that you're going to be asked to participate in.
as well as consent. I mean, and that's the fine line, right?
Yeah.
It's like, can I talk to such and such from the community in order to define my project further? But is that definition of the project becomes research data? I mean, it's tricky for us. I think for all of us, it's gonna be tricky. And I encourage a couple of the projects will be coming directly to the University of Delaware. And like I said, our office is always open to converse with any of you and see if we can navigate, we've done it in the past, that process the easiest way possible for everybody involved without crossing the line. I'm afraid of, well, go ahead and talk to whoever you need to, and suddenly we're really like, well, they should have signed a consent form before they went any farther. But at the same time, I understand that in order to give some of the details the IRB is expecting, right? And as you know, you may be familiar or not, but there's the process as well of getting the initial approval of your plan and the realization that amendments may come through as modifications are done or details are further defined. So sometimes you may not have the nitty-gritty we need, but here's the plan, here's who am I approaching and how am I approaching them, and if they need to sign a consent form or not, here is the form I will be presenting. And then as we move forward, further details are defined, I will be submitting an amendment to get that approved by the IRB. I mean, that may be an approach we need to take in certain cases, depending on the project and how it evolves. So you're protecting everybody involved from the beginning, understanding that at the end of the day, we need those concrete details.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've kind of gotten like pushback in very contradictory directions depending on the group. And, for instance, it's considered like a flaw if you were to say, on your timeline that you're doing anything other than hitting the ground running with your IRB protocol approved. Yet, I've been, so I recently had somebody react very strongly to when I said, well, we're going to meet with physician groups, we're going to meet with patient groups to, develop and refine the intervention, and then we'll submit the finalized protocol to the IRB. It's both like, well, if you don't do that, you know what I mean? If you don't, like, what's the point? Like, in a way, if you develop your full protocol and say, this is what we're going to do, and then you ask people for their input, do you know what I mean? Like, it's kind of like, it becomes just a face, like you're just.
And it's the challenge of interpreting those, 1970s regulations we work with.
Right.
What's participatory to research versus
and how they were written, and yes, they include social and behavioral research, but they're very much in the mindset of medical research, and you don't expect a doctor to come and say, well, I'll define the dose as I go, right? And it's like, we'll see how it plays out, and then we'll, and there is still, and some protocols do have that leeway, and we understand it. It's justified, and it's like, okay, this is the range, and they're working a range. This type of projects are very different in nature. It's like, well, but that's, as I was reading some of them, I think the importance of having good input from the community side already as you're planning the project. And that I wouldn't consider that research data. You are defining, they are investigators. So you're talking until you cross that line where your co-investigator becomes a giver of data or a provider of data, right? And you have to be sensitive to that, to say, I'm not collecting personal data from that individual without having had a process of consent to them, because they could get wrapped. But if you are in a normal academic environment and you have a team of collaborators, you're going to be having discussions about how you're going to be running that project and what you need to do before you get to the IRB. So I don't see a problem with that happening. It's just that fine line where it's like, okay, are they part of your team? And they should be. But at the same time, you could be an example, right? It's like, well, you're engaged in that autistic research, and you're going to be giving them a guide of what is needed, for example. But then suddenly the conversation turns around and says, well, tell me about your family and give me your experience. Well, suddenly you turn him into a research subject. And what is his process of consent where he understood his data may be used?
Yeah, again, to me, is this a consultation with the community that you have some community or are you really doing formal focus groups? In which case, then, it looks more like research itself is part of the protocol that you can then amend the protocol later. So there's so many shades. And the one thing I have to say, at least my experience has been, and based on what you just said, there's so much subjectivity because people look at it differently. And it's a blessing and a curse because from the investigator's standpoint, you want to know exactly what you need to do and you want to know what the requirement is. And from the institution's perspective, you want different eyes on it for different perspectives because it's reviewed differently. Just to throw something in there that's new right now, NIH might be looking at centralized IRBs for multi-site studies. And there's a huge problem in my mind with that. Yes, it might be efficient, but to me, one of the blessings of what we do and how we protect people is we have many eyes from different institutions, from different perspectives, looking at these multi-site studies. And sometimes, and I'll give an example that's very difficult to hear. There's a particular disease state, SMA, spinal muscular atrophy, and it's when it's with newborns. They don't thrive after maybe a year or two. Are you familiar? So this one institute, right, from this we're doing research at the Moores in this particular area, and it's promising. But the problem is that in a one multi-site study, there is a large research institution that declared these kids unviable fetuses. These are kids who were born and being taken care of, and so how did they get unviable fetuses as a result of their review, which now the FDA has to go back and look at. And this is last year. So I'm not talking about Tuskegee way back when we can sit there and say, I'm saying these problems occur all the time. Different eyes have different perspectives. So you're always going to get a level of subjectivity. So you always want to, I guess the lesson is, you be as thorough as you can be when you're communicating what it is you're going to do and who you're going to be working with and how you're going to be working with them as you're producing your protocol. Because there are going to be different eyes interpreting your work potentially differently. So the clarity of it is what I think is most critical.
And I don't know if you had already had the background on the basic ethical principles.
Good point.
Yes. I'm thinking of, I don't know what type of background these seminars are providing, but basically.
Everybody's supposed to go through city training, so.
Have you already done that? Okay. So
Okay.
you've heard about beneficence and justice and, so.
Autonomy.
The autonomy. So basically those are the points where the IRB is going to be honing, right? That your consent-informed process, not just document, process is well defined. And that you have thought about who is carrying the burden of the research and the benefit of the research, as well as that risk-benefit ratio. But I didn't know exactly if you had done it already or not.
And just one interesting story, I was at a conference with Liz and with Jen and a couple of others, and there was a gentleman from Harvard who actually has city training because he's doing community-based research with high school kids. And he has each one of those high school kids go through city. And I found that fascinating because one of the biggest pushbacks I always get is community doesn't want to do city training. Yet, if I can get high school level kids to be involved and be engaged and successfully go through it, it's hard for me to sit there and say that the community members who want to actually participate on a team can't do it. So, do you want to just slide one more? All right, I had to lighten up the room a little bit, just a little bit. So you know what currently you have to do in order to get something published. And I know this is what it feels like because I've done it. And it seems to be, and at times even through the IRB, this is what you have to accomplish. Imagine a community member seeing this for the first time. They're not going to understand this. They're not going to be thinking the way you are about what you have to do in order to accomplish, to get your paper accepted. And probably are going to turn around and run the other way. So be prepared that the idea that they have to go through an IRB, that they have to participate in all the activities required to engage in human subjects research, you're going to have to guide them through it. if they are external to this process or first time engaged in this process, and that's going to take some extra patience on your part. Go ahead. This goes back to sort of what Maria was talking about earlier. It's the same approval criteria. You know, we have to look at things like justice, beneficence, and autonomy, or respect for persons is another way to word that. But because of the involvement in the community, we don't have really a lot of guidance from FDA, from HHS. This is really a new movement. So we're sort of moving along with you guys, trying to think about what is the best way to manage this. Kristen?
And in some cases, I would add, if you know the communities you're going to be working with, the IRB will greatly benefit from your guidance to them on what that community entails, what it means, their social nature, because we may not, I mean, we have community members, but your community may be various. We don't have autistic representation in our board. As far as I know, I mean, we haven't asked. Somebody could say, no, I do have a family member. It's not described in our roster, unless somebody says, I have personal experience with that. It has happened to us in the past. It's the same thing with international research. We have had cases of people going to India, and it's like we're sitting in there, and they're telling us, and informed consent in India is not going to work the way we for kids, for children in a school. It's not going to work the way we envision it here, and we expect it to be here, because you can't send a kid home with a paper and hope to get it back. Their parents are trusting the schools to run their lives, their kids' lives. So it's a very different cultural setup. So, and we've benefited from trusting and sometimes we'll go to experts if we need to, but a little bit of background and education to us, to the board, on what the community entails and what you're going to need to approach them is very beneficial. It's like the fact that a researcher comes to us showing knowledge of the field, whatever the field is, facilitates the process greatly, obviously, because we trust that they know they have the right people in their teams. You may not be an expert on it, but your community member, your community collaborator will be the liaison you need to reach the community in an effective way. So I think that's a useful component when you describe your protocols and you put together your teams, and especially in this community participatory research. I think it's important to, if you have already identified and you have the connections, and I saw them in some of the projects, where the connections have been established with people that are going to bring that community side to the project. That's very important, other than, I'm going to go out and see if I can find the right person. I'm going to be interviewing. Definitely that work ahead of time is helpful.
Who are the gatekeepers for that particular area of interest? Because, you want to make sure that you've identified the right people, which is not always so easy to do. And as a scientist, my first thought is, how do I find them? Mm-hmm. And that's homework. That's shoe leather. And there's no right or wrong answer. It's becoming engaged in the community. And I have to, trust me, I have more allegories about that. But, and I've got one I'll share in a little while. But it's not an easy thing. So as you're developing your protocol, I think these are some very succinct things that Maria has just shared that you want to consider. What's the extent of community involvement? What's the difference in definition of the problem presented by various constituents in the community? What's the process for determining that? What's justification for the research, and are there concrete action outcomes? My favorite, and for those of you who have participated in research, how much have you actually learned when the research was over? Did anybody get back in touch with you? Did you have to go out and seek the results? I didn't get anything unless I went out and hunted it down. And I found that infuriating. And it's not that it's easy to do. And I consider myself educated, right? I'm a researcher myself. I have a history of it. Yet I didn't think about, when I said yes, I checked the box, we will participate at the time, and how will I find the results of this study? Will I be sent a copy of the published article? What will be given to me? So I think that's important. You want to make sure that the community, you're considering the community and what their needs are as far as outcomes. Who in the community will benefit from the research? And another one is it in any way the community at risk from the research? And that's something else that you need to be clear, that you need to understand. There could be risks to the community. And we've heard about some of that. And what will that look like? There was a case, I don't know if you knew about that. There's an Indian tribe that lives in the Grand Canyon. Did you hear about this one?
Yeah,
2010, it got settled. Arizona State went in, and this is one of the allegories I warned you I was going to share with you. Arizona State went in and they were going to do, this was around 1990, and they were taking blood. And because this population of this Native American tribe has a huge incident of diabetes. And they assigned consents, and they went ahead and took the blood, and they were talking about one area of interest. Well, the next thing you know, for whatever reason, next they were studying mental illness within this community that nobody was told that they were going to be studying based on their genetic makeup. They started looking at anthropologically, they were looking at how their stories might be inaccurate as far as their tribal culture based off of genetics. So the breadth of the research expanded beyond what they originally thought they were consenting for. Now, the tribe really didn't know what to do, so they did what the tribe law lets them do. They banned the researchers from ever stepping foot within, their land. But they took it one step further and went to the U.S. courts and settled for $700,000. And in 2010, the Arizona State University had to turn over every sample they had back to the tribe. So the idea, I guess, the point is you're consenting people, and especially with gene testing, which is really difficult right now because people are looking to set up these banks, these biobanks all over the place. People want to know what their specimens are being used for, what their data is being used for, how is it being collected, and are you informing them of not just what you're looking at now, but the potential of what it could be later. And you can get to Henrietta Lacks and all the other things like what happened at Hopkins, how data can live on well beyond its initial intent. So consider that when you're thinking about writing the consents.
So I just want to, so I'm thinking if we could, maybe in about 10 minutes or less, whatever, that we could transition to the team by team.
Yes.
The 14, 10 to 15
Sure.
for each. I just want to.
I know. Once I get started, I apologize. I can be really wordy. So you have the slides. So you can take a look at methodology about what you want to include, participants. The key one here, see, when I want to hurry, I stand up, and then I start really going through it. Community may be defined by a disorder, a condition, a geographic zone. Community is a broad term, right? So cancer survivors, there's a community you're working with. Special needs, home healthcare workers, whoever it is, obese population, it could be physicians. So when we talk about community, I always think of, geographic zone and maybe a particular disease state because that's where my mind goes. But it's broad. Okay, go ahead. Let's zoom to the next one. Okay, we just discussed it. Okay, keep going. Okay. Traditional protocols, we look at sample size and power statements, inclusion, exclusion criteria. In this work, in community-based participatory research, we may want to assess the right persons in the community that we have identified as the participant. And they may be service providers, community leaders. And also to be reviewed, which I gave an example with the Arizona, with the Grand Canyon tribe, whether marginalized community members will be included. Because what they did to those particular folks in Arizona was marginalize them by just expanding the scope of the research and really not with giving them a general consent and not telling them how it could potentially be used in the long term. Go ahead. Recruitment. I know for myself and for our IRB, recruitment strategies are critical to explain. We want to know because the issues around coercion with a pediatric population and making sure parents are informed of what they're doing. And I've already had a conversation with Steve about his particular protocol because we had an opportunity to talk about it. But that's something to really consider. Are you culturally sensitive? There's actually a group that Liz and I heard present in Chicago from Hawaii. And you have to actually go into this population on Maui and introduce yourself and get to know them before they'll let you do any kind of research within the specific Hawaiian population. And as they say, there's no data without us. I mean, it just isn't. So if you don't acknowledge us as people, as a community, the researchers at University of Hawaii had to eat with them, had to learn tribal dances, had to actually begin to participate in order to become involved with that particular population.
And in some of those cultures, the final consent or may come from the tribe leader.
Yes.
And as I was talking in India, and you may not get to the individual level because culturally stops there. If the leader says yay, everybody's going to do it. And for the IRB to understand that, I mean, obviously the IRB is going to be pushing you. How are they going to be signing this in front of them? It's like, look, it's not going to work in this particular context. So.
And I think the second one here, who decides on the research questions, whether they're coming out of the community versus whether they're coming from the researcher into the community, or whether it's shared expectation. And when I think about what your example, Heather, that's sometimes how it might potentially change based on community input of some initial negotiation and discussion. I know, Brian, you and Terza had some development in your pilot grant where you were talking about potentially changing recruitment sites based on feedback from the community.
Right.
And the IRB is going to try to be as flexible as it can be so that you can amend your protocols in order to be able to do this. But again, as Maria pointed out, it's new to us too. So,
but it is a living,
yes.
organism. I mean, don't think of the IRB as, oh, I got my approval. Here is what I had to write for it, and then I go. It is the living process, and you're going to be coming back with details and fine-tuning. And it shouldn't be an extra hurdle. It shouldn't delay you much. I mean, projects are going to be reviewed depending on the level of risk, either in an expedited or full-bore fashion. The fact that you have to amend that, I mean, don't think about it like, well, now I'm going to have to make a change and it's going to take me 3 months to get it through. It's usually not the case. And most of those changes for fine-tuned processes you are implementing are small enough that will be expedited, that will be approved in a timely fashion. So we're working together on this. Don't be afraid of the IRB. And you do have an obligation to follow your protocol and for your protocol to follow your research, so that you don't deviate much from the protocol that you've got approved without a prior approval for that, basically.
Go ahead. Okay, well, we already talked about risk benefits, so I don't think we really need to get into that too much. Another little levity thing that I found, because I know that and my allegory for that, when I was at CHOP with my son, I literally had somebody standing over me waiting for me to sign a consent form, so that, with a pen in hand. And that's one of the particular instances where I said, no, this is not right. And I already knew we were in the particular pool for DNA research. And so I know it looks funny, but it does happen. And you don't want it to happen. You want to make sure that people have an easy consent to understand, and that they have time and it can be thoughtful in being able to negotiate, discuss with you what it means then when they sign it. And then if they decide to sign it, understand that it's voluntary and they can withdraw that participation at any time. So again, how's the community told about the purpose of the study, the plan for the research, inclusion and exclusion criteria? Are there MOUs involved? And again, you might need to go to your office's sponsored projects to talk to them to see if you're working with other organizations, how those relationships pan out. And you're going to do that in advance whenever possible. I know at Nemours, if MOUs and agreements aren't in place, the IRB will hold up the review of the protocol. So just as
Ours is a little bit reversed, actually.
Oh, really? Okay.
Depending on the agreement, if it involves human subjects researching the background, for that agreement to be signed, our office, and I'm not the one signing those agreements, but I will be verifying that the IRB has been submitted and approved before it's kind of a parallel process, but we won't be signing an MOU that we don't have an IRB submission for, if it's next one.
Right.
So, see, that's where.
It's a little different.
It's a little different.
And again, between us, between University of Delaware, Christiana, and if Jerry were here, I'm sure he would say, there are shades of difference between how the organizations operate. Thanks, Kristen.
And Jerry did send his regrets. He really wanted to be here.
Keep going, Kristen. We sort of gone over that. We've talked about that. None of these folks are dispassionate and unengaged, so I don't even need to talk about that. And Brian will get up on a chair later with a red flag yelling, "Equity for all." So I got this out of the Chicago conference I went to, and I really loved it. And it was a great statement. If you're a community organization or a community person engaged in research with an organization, where would you like to be in the following model? Would you like research on you, within you, or with you? And I personally prefer it with me. I would think most people would, to be part of or have it with them, as opposed to being placed on them. So I just needed to share that. So now we have questions, we can sit down, we can have a work session, whatever you need.
Well, why don't we do this? Just a little nuts and bolts. We'll take a break, and then we'll come back and go team by team. Sound good? We only got like 1.5 evaluations last time. So I'm going to lay myself down in the door, not let them leave. And just think, but we're just going to give them out on paper. She knows who did and didn't, so she knows.
And you know who you are.
She doesn't know me, so I don't take my eye contact or lack of it as anything. But if you want, we could just plan for 5 minutes at the end every time to do it on paper.
Well, if I can pander, this is the first time I've had an opportunity to deliver this particular presentation with Maria, so how I can grow, how I can get better at it, because this is something that I really want to do well for you all. The feedback would be greatly appreciated, so the recommendations, if you could take the time, I sure would appreciate it.
I guess I'm just a little concerned because I've been doing them online, and I know we had the first time I'd done it, there had been a challenge where it had said everything had been saved, and then Jennifer had said I don't think it went through, and I did it again, and then
yours is like half. The
See,
process evaluation is like halfway done.
See, and it's fully done twice. So there might be something computer wise going on.
I know, I filled it out after.
Yeah, you're good.
I would not be shocked.
Yeah.
We just found it too compliant.
And don't take it out of Maria and I.
We made disclosures, we shouldn't, we just reveal the subject.
Because I did it online as well.
Yeah.
We'll look into it then, and probably then from what I'm hearing, we probably will go with like a paper
Paper,
method.
sure.
Until we can figure out the why it's not functioning and
Yeah.
how to fix it, because in the end, we might
The group
fix
is
it.
small enough that I think you can.
Yeah.
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 How long a break?
We're gonna take 5 minutes,
Okay.
okay? And,
Go to your right.
Water,
and
vodka, it's all the same.
Yeah.
It's like some of these new vodkas, they mess you up.
we're gonna come back and do your group's research questions, if we didn't get it to it
These are good
before.
stuff.
So I just,
I'm glad to have
it's
them.
been a long
Oh,
time,
good.
I was thinking about it today, and I was like, if it was
Yeah,
something
that's
we
right.
had to do today, I'd be like, I don't remember what we talked
One
about.
thing with consent,
So,
and one thing
you know,
that
if
is
you wanna refresh yourselves or.
the role of
Next
incentives.
time, we'll, like we did the other two groups, we'll do
Yeah,
that.
we could talk about,
And
Guess what I remember?
What is their time work?
yeah, what's their time work and what is potentially coercive, you know?
Correct.
they're offering-
Oh,
And we talk about that all the time.
Well, I
Don't
would,
give them, don't give them a
Don't give them
oh, you did, okay.
I wish I had just went ahead and bought it.
We've had problems before, like with things
That
like.
was the first time I've ever used
We used to try to
Amazon.
do
Oh,
something
okay.
And the
like
book
when we did the
was
service
all
at the
marked up
university.
and
Yeah.
I
everything.
remember Apple for an iPhone.
Okay.
Yeah,
And was that,
no, that's
Okay,
great.
maybe I'll help.
More's than you find.
okay, we
But
had
I-
problems with
I-
that.
I would approve that.
It's,
Because, you know why? Everybody has an equal chance.
That's right.
And you're not offering $100 whatever dollar thing to a survey.
The other thing, though, you gotta make sure that
I work for Machine Care.
the fact that you put in your name, that you want to be in the iPod, you can't.
I did
Questionnaire, so it's gotta have.
city
It's gotta
thing,
be
and I said, oh,
even when we do that,
I'm sorry I didn't hand it in earlier. Trying to be compliant.
no, I meant the proposal.
The Delaware survey told himself he was having trouble getting.
You know, by the end, the whole point, I think, is by the end
And
of
he
this,
wanted to increase the incentive
that
for it. And I said,
not
the
only
problem,
do
you
you
know,
feel like
is
you
you
have
already
a comfort
promised
level with what
incentive
you're
for people
proposing,
to have
but that you
to
feel like it's
participate
actually
in certain.
So you are creating a year.
Correct. And so that's what I said.
I got concerned
So
about.
what if you started out as like, you didn't offer
Why?
incentive at all?
Yeah, and that's a
I got a
tough
little
one.
nervous.
That's a tough one. Even, you know,
Yeah,
you
you have
even
to-
look at that.
could you do that, or would you say no, because you didn't offer the first people?
No, I think,
Incentive.
I think
A lot
you
of
could,
it.
but it's how you do it. I think it's-
Consultation
As
stuff,
long as
you know,
everybody has
the
equal
real
opportunity
thing that
to
you have
get
to
it.
decide, and I think the research
So,
question is gonna.
by the way, we decided
to
we're offering
tell
$25, you signed
when
up,
you move-
here's your
So we could
$25.
retroactively give them.
Correct.
Building the
Yeah.
idea for the
Assuming we
program
knew who they
to
were.
switch
Well,
over to that
that's-
research.
And that would be something you have to
Maybe working with the
consider,
community for
because
input and
if
this
you
and that, and then at
de-identified
what
it,
point
there's no
does
way
it
to
become
say we
research? The
participated,
research question,
then
I
we would
think,
have
is
a
really gonna
Yeah.
help
Okay.
to be the thing
Well,
that
It's
says
just
that.
about being
I
fair.
was concerned that if the people that I had,
I know, trying to get your
Are
head
the right
is always hard.
That's right, that's it. And they may not be,
Especially
but
when
that's
you're dealing
okay,
with large population surveys.
you know?
What is reasonable?
Or we're hard to risk, I know, we're working on a project now with Hispanic women in Miami. They're doing fine in getting Hispanic men, but it's getting the Hispanic women who have substance abuse.
Kristen, just,
issues.
if I'm not back right now, you know, 10:05, but people have
to do.
reaccumulated,
So
just
what
go
can we
ahead
do
and
to sort of-
tell them to get started.
At the moment, it's just been sort of increasing the places that we recruit from, looking around for other sources to recruit from, which we, to get more.
You wanna
money.
escape that.
But we haven't gone.
No,
through
no,
any time
no, it's
offering
true.
more money, because they do get an incentive.
Do you mind, I feel
At the
like
moment,
that's so
we're
like.
participating, but so at the moment, we're just trying to do it with.
I don't look at it
getting
like
more
that.
Sources of.
There's other ways to do it. Let's say that you offered a $25
Let me ask you
incentive
this,
and
if I
you
were
got
to
50% of your population signed up.
cafeteria,
I'll
like
do
a
it.
cold beverage or?
How are you?
they're in the middle of
And
sharing.
everybody who participates, your whole town has access to it.
Oh, I'm
That's
a
actually,
water
that's
kid.
an interesting.
And that makes it fair. So you're always looking
No,
for
she's
equity
down in Florida, which
as far as making sure everybody has access. You know, and I think,
But she just
yeah,
had-
talk to Maria about that. I would approve something like
Yeah,
that.
that's a possibility.
No.
Brian, I
What I really want is a coffee beverage
There's
and
nothing but
water
trouble.
or seltzer water, if they would have it.
Question
don't
is,
give it all away.
If nothing else, it's.
Oh, I saw something interesting the other day.
for my family,
There was a project at the University of New Mexico right now on,
I would
and
drink
they're
all of that,
working
but
with,
yeah.
indigenous, you know.
no one was
indigenous
broke,
How about
one was
this?
wrong.
folks. And it's sort of
Yeah.
this
You are very
large groups that work.
You mind that?
It's too much, it was too much.
I thought it was really glaring, I kept rubbing my
Same way, I
eyes.
went
So, do you mind? You're the best.
So we turned lights off because
Established.
glaring
I'm
elements.
more concerned.
Oh, we don't need that.
Like
Heather, you can minimize that. I'm just looking for something.
my family.
Where it's advisory boards, but for the consent process. So they've developed these, they've developed these.
I thought you might mention the project we have in Gladys, where I think we have 15 packages now, so it's not fair.
they are alive and going, yes, yes. We, some of, you know, now we know how the process is. Some institutions, like the hospital, we have 5 years from start. We know 5 years of the history.
I don't know if there's a way.
There is, and we've done it in some cases with, especially the churches have grown, not so much the same for many amendments, but kind of like an octopus.
Yeah.
That kind of grows, and you get an amendment
You get a
that
new
is,
tentacle.
that is not quite the same project anymore, and they just present us an amendment, and it can be challenging to manage.
Right,
Because if there are people who are at, and that has to be where you might want
if there's someone else who can recommend.
That's-
I think just as they start to put it together,
Yeah,
maybe a
that's-
little questions.
Yeah, I can be the person, I can refer to people, some of them will be expedited depending on the, I mean, usually most of them will be expedited, but I can be the liaison person and I can direct them deeper in the, if we need to. No.
So,
Yeah.
it's interesting.
I mean, there
We actually had a meeting about our IRB
I like
process on Monday.
I think the more creative we get,
But I have to do it so in early stages, I think, because we're going to deal with groups of parents and kids with disabilities as well as kids. Parents agree to have them participate.
I just,
A couple of them. We're trying to decide, do we want the same,
Not necessarily
like the parents and the kids both to participate, whether it's
no, never.
parents associated with the kids as well, so.
Plus,
So Heather,
if I read from what I read,
there's- I don't know where we are with
this.
Well,
wait a while, there's one more spot in the January CVIP moderation training, and then it can be finished for 6 months. One at the Classes Scholar in South Carolina, so that's out, and then there's the, I mean, they are continuous, I just don't know.
So kudos, you somehow officially under the ADA.
Seriously?
Yeah.
Wow.
I don't think that's a discrimination in being in mainstream classrooms, because they have to have separate lunches.
That's right.
So like, so that, we talked about disabilities.
I mean, that's what I was saying. You can go anywhere from hearing deficient to accomplices, I guess.
And our definition is going to be in terms of Department of Education has defined as having what they call an IEP classification, which.
Oh, it's that alive, that's good.
We're going to classroom. So we're going to start with that. But then we're going to pull those. I know. Some of them are behavioral issues, some of them are really just, their kids are instructed in the classroom, actually makes a problem. They get all the breaks in the classroom and put them in special classrooms.
I'll just,
Really even unclear what
just
their
say,
issues
you know,
are.
thanks for your ongoing consideration.
So, I mean, you're saying
Class
probably
I will be available to take in February.
I know, but then we actually mentioned those populations, I expect it's going to be more green. Don't possibly, if we.
I thought it was around there.
Yeah, if the kids haven't yet evolved.
We're not yet directly involved in collecting.
Yeah, that's definitely, I mean, you're just basically getting feedback from the parents as to what that kids need.
And what you talked about is, we have some disabilities counselors, and we're working on some of the protocols. Some of them also have kids with disabilities, and so they'll start talking about those kids. We're not treating that as research data, we're not collecting anything on it, so it may inform what we decide to do.
The problem is,
It can be worked out, I mean, it's fine line, it's just what I did, but it's professional guide. It's just, and you're more familiar than probably say, I mean, I don't know that the others would be going to different. IRB, and the Christiana Lab project would be, and then the Christiana IRB project, you're more familiar with how to walk through and what we kind of expect, or we need to drive, that'd be fine.
And I've actually done IRBs in all the institutions.
So you do have a good comparison of how we pan out.
The thing I was going along with that
Right.
I've never seen that.
One of the protocols we put through medicated assisted treatment was the same protocol submitted to six different IRBs.
You
We
can
got
get them
the
there.
same.
I understand.
No revisions, no suggestions, and a whole scale of things in between. So you realize, I might not want to use something's paper, but I wasn't sure I had approval. To do it, you know, because-
My name is Brian, but this is my day, that's the IRB.
That's right, everything's in the IRBs, you know.
and as a teenager, you know, that goes wrong letter.
Oh, it's
And
totally.
7 years ago, I had nothing to do, I had a slightly different organization probably than my predecessor. And that's just the office, right, and the board has changed composition, so.
Having a new board chair, every time you get a new board, there are changes.
Yeah, everything, I mean, it's living, and there's only given so much
it's
Like,
not.
it's not exempt.
I mean, there is sort of like medical risks that we're really looking for. But what type of language you're gonna be asked to put in any formats and really changes.
Value added, yeah.
Depending what happened, cases that came through and raised concerns, kind of took the language here or there just because you didn't wanna call it. And
Right.
so,
Oh,
and
yeah.
as you have experience in it,
Thanks,
from the
Nancy.
time frame they work with and how long it takes to the details and the resolution they're gonna get from your project.
Putting the lower number in there, which makes the higher number seem like, you know,
Biomedical and our risk determination, so that's
Oh,
what we
what was I
determine.
thinking?
Falling more than minimum risk.
Aaron and I just
I would say easier, but
shared Aaron's
I think
presentation.
that hospital
I want to
kind
stick
of laughed
So
at our
they take it to the
presentation
AG,
days, like, that's
she
not
thinks that
but again, it's all the next one, our work side, I guess,
Brian,
Well, I printed a bunch of those.
yeah, it's just like,
Oh, did you?
just
Just
like
because I
moving,
thought-
moving pieces.
That's right. You just go with it.
Yeah, there was one at APJ.
You were not
We've been
a-
out of-
No, if you've never been to New Orleans.
And actually paid attention.
If you log, I'll log in and find, because I think they just recently posted all of the.
I was gonna ask you about this, is there cost, like, nominal
You
fee
have
to
some
get
board members,
access to
though.
all of them?
They want to define the research, they want to fix the research project and not worry about
No,
the
I
substance.
wanted to do that too. Anyone falling there, they reported a design or a small, and they just wanna help pay for
The professional thing, and sometimes
cost of
it's
doing
just,
So,
sometimes,
the.
sorry.
Next year,
It's not going anywhere, and
APJ
That's
conference in
not-
Chicago.
we're not putting it into it,
Exactly.
it's not solid, or it's not
Right,
sound.
and for the research, community engagement research track, I think we should
Trying
submit
to,
something
I'm questioning
for
some of the.
Oh, yeah.
particularly,
Where they had the I think that's really key and important.
Particularly from
In order to make sure you
May do
understand.
it
What reason was to have CPR set aside?
Which is kind of a research question, but it's going to that.
Because we have one, we're
You have to go this time.
Terps and I are some of the ones that we have, some of the qualitative data, we don't have the quantitative data. I think there definitely should be one.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I was.
But it's tricky, there's a risk benefit kind of stuff. You can say, with this very minimal risk, looking at something so project is so worthless, that therefore the risk doesn't exceed the benefit, because there is no benefit.
You see it as a waste of time. I mean, will you find somebody like it's a waste of time? No, don't look quite in those words, but you will be required. I go everywhere. Are you your kinds of cool places. Same thing with risk.
Warm way.
There are precedents for this. What comes to us. Prepare with the background and say, this is the range I'm working with, because this is what the literature tells me, that is safe or not, here's the risk I'm taking, and I'm knowledgeable.
Yeah.
So then,
In that I participate.
Where was it?
In an out with them.
Oh,
in
nice.
February.
Oh, you
And
just
these
here, that's
guys,
great.
it started at 10, and then they break it
Yes.
in 2, and 2
Fabulous.
hours, and it's dinner and you're done. So they're coming in, everybody showed up for speed paint.
Yeah, sure.
And it's at the Ritz Carlton. So it's gorgeous. But I was sitting there thinking, I hate the cold. I haven't skied since I was a kid. And I love Tahoe.
All right, you gotta get working.
I am just beginning.
In a way, I hate to interrupt all
good, you're only
the
just
sort of
beginning.
sidebar
It's been going on for a while for me.
Sometimes those are the most productive. But we do have a timeline. I want everyone to get their fair share. So we're gonna go team by team. And in fairness, since I know the teams on that side of the room got through their research question and we ran out of time, I'm gonna start on this side of the room. That's okay. So Brian, I'll leave it up to you which one you wanna present first to these guys for a discussion.
So, okay, so I guess we'll present on the community health worker research. So The idea for, and I'm sure, have you both had a chance to look at it? So,
Yeah.
okay, so the idea is that, right now there's a lot of movement in both payment reform as well as practice redesign models, and coming from CMS all the way down into, community level primary care settings, around extending the team of primary care practitioners outreach into the community. And there's sort of different models for that. One of the most utilized models is sort of a case management approach, where you have within a population health framework, you have an identified group of people with certain disease statuses that you're targeting for intervention, and you're using either health coaches or community health workers or something like that to do this outreach, and in the hopes that you can provide better care at lower cost, that the whole triple aim. Anyway, one of the issues that this work has faced is there's a lot of issues, but one of them has been sort of a lack of understanding from a patient-centered perspective what the value of those interactions are in terms of improving care. A lot of it has been defined, particularly from a clinical standpoint or an institutional standpoint, where you want to drive down A1C levels, or make sure that people are getting their exercise and doing this and that. Whereas in some previous work that I've been able to do with some health coaches here at Christiana, what we're hearing from patients is more value around sort of the relationship that they're forming with these individuals, and the reliability that they have somebody on the phone that they can call up and talk to, and make sure that their questions can be answered, and that they can be connected with care in a meaningful way. So what I was interested in looking at here, and what the team was interested in looking at here, is that although in Delaware, there's currently roughly 3 different models, if you can put them in bubbles, that are working in this space. One is a more traditional case management model, like I said before, very much directed from the hospitals and the institutions outward. Another model is more of a upstream community health liaison or community health worker model, where these sort of lay health folks are doing a lot more work around the social aspects of community health and influencing that. And then there's another that sort of fits in between those two things. What's missing is sort of a common language around evaluation and metrics for these things, so that it's hard to say that one is better than the other, or that a combination of 2 or all 3 is going to be most effective in improving health and lowering costs. So what we wanted to do was actually get that patient perspective. And so we wanted to work with community health workers, as they're sort of globally defined, to be part of our research team, to go out and conduct focus groups in the 3 different counties of Delaware with patients and family members of patients who have interacted with these folks over time, and get their feedback in terms of how they define the value of those interactions. Take that qualitative information and begin to work out some common evaluation metrics that could perhaps be used as patient surveys or satisfaction surveys within the programs as they currently exist. And then a subsequent grant submission might be to actually test the validity of those instruments. And that's where we're at in a sort of a nutshell. And so the research question, so to speak, is sort of what is the patient, how do patients themselves define the value of community health workers as it exists within their healthcare sort of spectrum, whatever it might be.
Which challenging, I guess, from the heterogeneity of your populations in the patient world, right? And how they may define, each individual may define a very different value to it. But you were considering then your health care workers part of your team, right?
Mm-hmm. As research
co-investigators, but as well, are you getting data from them as well? As not really. Or focus groups.
So the data that we would be getting from them, they wouldn't be necessarily participants in the focus groups themselves. What we're looking at primarily are patients and family members of patients as focus group participants.
Both adult and child?
That's a good question. We haven't really settled on that yet. What we were aiming, I think, leaning towards is adult family members of children who perhaps have worked with the Nemours, program around asthma, for instance. Most of the other groups of the three groups that we identified, I think the other two are primarily dealing with adults anyway. So the patients would be the participants in the focus group, so that the qualitative data that we would be getting back in terms of their perceptions of value and impact and all that sort of thing, effectiveness, would be fed back into the program team, which includes the community health workers, who would assess that data, analyze that data, code into teams and all that sort of thing in a partnership, and then utilize that information to perhaps begin to create these measurement tools.
Community health workers wouldn't be in the focus group, but would likely recruit the participants.
So they would be providing that informed consent process, right?
Because they have that relationship.
Right.
So,
Which,
go ahead.
And that would be maybe a question, how close are those relationships, and could that
Influence?
Yes.
Well, I would think that the community health worker couldn't be involved in the focus group where their
All people
patients were, right?
Right. I mean, that may be a layer the IRB may want to introduce, but it's not, of course, at least the consenting. I mean, after that, you may say, well, once the participant knows what they are signing for and they did that freely and completely informed, then the rest of the interactions could be with the people they know. But that consent process.
I'd flag it.
Do you?
I would, because I would think, depending on the questions, if you're asking about quality of service,
Yeah.
I would flag that, because if I'm your focus group worker, and now you're telling me that you're saying you don't feel you're getting good service,
Right.
I think that there's some coercion
Yeah, but
there
I
that
think what we would
potentially
say
changes
is we
the
wouldn't
data.
assign the same community health worker to the
Right. So
the
like,
participants that they work with. So the Latina, the one in Spanish wouldn't have the Latina community health worker in that focus group.
or run it, or
Run it, or
conduct that
have
focus
be
group,
visible, or be able to hear it. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. But you can see, we have different eyes on it. And so when you're thinking about it, and I think you're thinking about it correctly, to me, this is an expeditable study. It's pretty straightforward, because you're collecting qualitative focus group or maybe even interview data. So the consents are going to be pretty straightforward. It's with adults, so there's no subpart D determination that goes with it. So,
Are you guys gonna transcribe data
Yeah.
and
Just
analyze?
the
so
way
data
would I
security
do it?
becomes an
Are you
issue.
recording
Yeah,
or
it would be-
videotaping
Yeah,
anything?
we were the way, at least the way that I traditionally do it when I conduct it is audio record it and then have it transcribed and then utilize that information. But so that would all be included in the consent. Obviously, that this information will be recorded and.
Are you going to ask for PHI?
It may come up in the conversations if it's offered by the individuals, but we're not asking specifically about protected health information. So the notion is that at least the direction that we were heading is that oftentimes as the programs are defined and the outcomes are defined, they're primarily defined by the funder of the grant programs that are running these things. And then subsequently, any secondary level of value is usually defined by the institutions in terms of whether it can keep kids out of the emergency department or that sort of thing, which is fine. And there's different definitions, I think, of roles for these type of individuals to play in the community. But we think what the common linkage is the patient-centered perspective of value. And regardless of whether or not it's a strictly case management type of model versus a more upstream interaction.
Is there a chart review associated with that to prove your hypothesis that they are as a reduction in?
No, we're not. No.
They're not mentioning that.
I'm not interested. Like we would know because of the team that we've assembled includes sort of the people who are running these programs at these three institutions. Right, so they can tell us what the goals and the intended outcomes of the program are, which are different. But what we're interested in hearing is if there's any commonality from the patient perspective, and whether or not that can be translated into a measurable, metric, for instance, whether it's related to patient satisfaction or activation or whatever it might be, for all of these programs to use across the board, so that we can say, okay, over time, for the next 5 years, if these groups are using regardless of what their intended outcomes are from a grant perspective, if they're all agree to use this sort of measurement of patient-centered value, then we can begin to assess what the impact of, quote-unquote, community health workers are in the state, because right now we don't have that information.
About how many are there this year? What's your total sample target?
Well, right, for at least,
roughly.
we're looking at 12 focus groups, so 4 in each county, of roughly 10 to 15.
Because I was going to get at, if you're doing transcriptions, and you're going to talk about like Hispanic, and you're going to talk about, children, if it's really small, you do have to worry that your community health worker, would kind of recognize who was saying what, based on.
But if we have, for instance, I get that. So, there'll be some things that we'll have to work out. But for instance, if we have, 6 community health workers that agree to participate on the team, right? I think we've already had 3 that have said they would. The one from Newcastle County might help to lead the focus groups that are conducted in Sussex County, and the one in Sussex might help to lead the focus groups that are conducted in Kent, and vice versa, so they would be, sort of mixed up in that way.
But the de-identification of the data when it's transcribed and how you clean it is going to probably be important. We never use individual names.
That's a note. I don't know how, and I've got a couple of informed consents in our system from Christiana. I would imagine you will be using the Christiana process, but we are very careful not to promise confidentiality in the context of focus groups. Because even though as a researcher, you're going to treat it confidentially, you can't guarantee that the people around the table.
Right.
And so we always make a point to say, to remind our participants that
every effort might be made, but there's always a
and out of respect, you shouldn't talk about this in other places, but we can't promise. That's something we have usually every time focus groups come. It's like kind of a standard language that is like, because you could be breaching that promise very easily. It's beyond your control.
So in the focus group guide for the facilitators, that would be included at the top in terms of introductions and languages. Say, please don't use your name or the name of your neighbor or whoever it might be.
And if you do, we'll try to describe. Whatever it is.
And when this is transcribed, we'll do our best to remove any identifying information. That sort of thing would be built into the protocol and the consent.
So in the interest of time, we have to transition to the next project. I'm going to keep you to 10 minutes, but I would also say these guys have probably looked at the protocols, so
familiar.
They're familiar. You don't have to necessarily start from the beginning.
In my project, my focus of interest was in trying to define. We know that this school-based setting where addressing childhood obesity has been very successful. I wanted to see whether or not other settings would yield as much productive outcomes, and that would be the faith-based community and civic associations, but primarily the faith-based community would be my focus. So at that point where with all the city instructions that I've learned thus far, I was really wanting to take back this whole thing.
Don't give up.
But I'm persistent, so I'm pressing on. I think the main area that I'm I'm looking at would be trying to get the right group, because I hadn't thought of that before. The right groups to be in partnership. So I've begun to ask the individuals, and in the original proposal, I was thinking that some of the health ministries that are already active would self-identify that they would want to participate. But I don't know if that is the correct way to go or not.
Are you trying to, when you talk about the school-based setting to prevent obesity and then transfer that, seeing if you want if transferring to a faith-based or other settings would be successful, what type of data are you planning? What will be your questions? Are you, for those health ministers, are you trying to find out how they operate, what they do, and
what I was looking at would be the influence of the faith-based community on getting the parents and the child to change their behavior based on the encouragement and the opportunities to be, I guess, accepted.
Motivated, yeah.
To be encouraged, and having a relationship between faith and health intersect to produce positive results.
But you're not planning, I think a question we would have is, you're not planning to implement an intervention yet, right? You're not.
Yes.
Yes.
That it would be like a curriculum for, like I was thinking, a few years ago we did Body and Soul in the faith-based community. So if we could give the parents, show them how to prepare foods and what foods to prepare that would be better for the health of the child, and have the church meals
done that way.
Yes, and demonstrations, cooking demonstrations at the churches, and using marketing, showing them how, like diabetes self-management, you have to go grocery shopping and show them things like. So those would be interventions.
What's the Body and Soul? Just curious.
It's a faith-based approach to. It really was a cancer model.
But it's like a sort of
a curriculum.
CDC?
Yes, the CDC.
So will you be using then already approved curriculums or tested curriculums?
Yes.
Or you're trying to not just make your own, but just like, I don't know, implement models that are already being
congregational setting.
So
and the same for the civic associations, like at the PAL Center, the neighborhood house, where teens would be, or young folks would gather to have those exercise, Zumba classes, nutrition classes.
Right. So there's different levels, and that's the hard part, because there's so many potential outcome measures that you could look at. Let's say, for example, you want to look at system level measures and try to see how the ministries handle the development and implementation of this program that you're trying to implement, and how you're going to get information from them, so then they become part of your participant group, right? The ministries themselves. Then you've got the parents, and how has their behavior changed as far as meal times, and how are you going to potentially determine that, which could be by a survey, by focus group, interview. You'll decide what the best way is, and then even down to the child level. I mean, and not to say that you want to go to that level, because it's more difficult in a lot of ways, but looking at their food behaviors, which you could do by a survey. You could do weight, like N. Haynes. So, and then you're getting into a lot more detailed level of data collection. So once you define, I guess, for me, where you want your outcomes to come from, what level you want your outcomes to come from, then the protocol becomes clear in my mind where I can sit there and make suggestions as far as how you're going to develop your consent, because you may have multiple consents. You may be consenting the ministries for their participation, the parents for their participation, and then assenting the children if they're participating as well. So, again, it's what outcomes across this whole spectrum of folks that you're looking to really achieve. So having a clear hypothesis in mind, and then, and you might be engaging the ministries on multiple levels. You might include the ministries as a team and help you develop the protocol.
Right.
So,
well, my question is, wouldn't a change in the parent and the child's behavior be the outcome that I'm trying to measure?
It could be. And an important thing to maybe remember on that is that you're going to need a before and after. If you're presenting an intervention, you're going to have to assess, you're going to have to measure where they are before you go in, and where they go after. So
I think
the survey or whatever you think, you know them better. Maybe you may say, well, a survey, are they going to do it or not? Or maybe a focus, but a survey would be a way of tracking each individual easier, definitely, and see if it had an impact on that.
I think, that's what I think I had it in my proposal, pre and post.
So, the beauty here, I think you have vision. You really do. You not only, have sort of some steps along the way, but I think you have a very broad vision of what you want to do in terms of action and really helping people. When I hear you speak, and I'll tell you a little bit of a discussion, Brian and I had, you have an aggressive sort of agenda in front of you. Do you know what I mean? And so at some point, I think the challenge is picking what's going to be your first step forward. And I just bring up, because it was interesting, because Brian and I had a discussion about your project, and what he thought you were going to do and what I thought you were going to do were not precisely the same. And I think they fit together. Brian was talking about, and I think this work needs to be done too, this idea of identifying the right partners, figuring out how they're going to function together as a group that can, lead to action. And even just in my mind, I was thinking, really, it would be about, can this group, somehow look at the literature, and decide, okay, of all the interventions out there, which one, do we think makes sense given how we want to do this? Or you could totally flip it on its head and say, before we pull all these people together and start looking at all these interventions, I think it's worth one round of taking, something fairly simple, and piloting it. Just is it feasible to do any, to deliver any curriculum in this setting? What happens when you ask the sort of non-professional people to deliver this curriculum? How did the people at the site react to bringing it in? What were the key things that if I were to repeat it in another site, I would, do again to gain trust? And do you know what I mean? Am I making sense?
There also might be an opportunity. You'll have to tell me if I'm wrong. But when I hear what you're talking about, I get excited because more as we're doing a lot of work in schools with obesity.
Yes.
So to hear potentially opportunity.
That's where I got the idea.
Of approaching this particular very difficult topic from multiple angles, multiple contexts, I think is wonderful. Developing your research design is difficult because it is a very complicated question. The mentoring group for the CTR, there might be opportunity for your support. Diana Benamarco is now taken over for Rob Akins in the mentoring group.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
See that? That's fine.
And there might be an opportunity, and I personally find her to be wonderful in helping to tease out these types of research designs.
Is she a UD person?
She's TJU, but in the Moors, TJU in the Moors. And because the population you're working with, I think she might be a really great connect there to help
What's
you.
her name?
Diane Albeta, and it's ALBATEMARCO. Albeta Marco. She's a professor at Thomas Jefferson, and she also works with the Morris.
Yeah, you'll make sure she gets her.
So, Lavina, do you mind if I add a few comments?
Of course not.
Okay,
No, jump in.
So one of the things that struck me early on in when Laveda was interested in pursuing the ACE process was when she began to describe to me sort of the scope of the potential partners and the folks that may want to be involved, or at least that she's identified as being a primary sort of focus for the involvement. I think there's a phenomenal richness there that I think is novel in terms of coalition development or building or partnership development around a specific issue like obesity prevention, for instance, or health. Everybody from the NAACP, health equity councils to the faith-based organizations and the health ministries. I think there's
In my sorority.
yeah, and your sorority. And I think looking through the literature, and I'm not super familiar with it, but I spent some time looking through what was out there around sort of these non-traditional approaches to intervening in health, that sort of thing. And I think there's just an immense amount of potential for understanding how these groups might be able to coalesce around an issue and move a community to be interested in addressing that issue. And I really think beyond any, and there may be an intervention involved or whatever, but I think beyond any outcomes data for a pre and post intervention, perhaps I think what really struck me as novel and exciting is that notion of these groups being able to perhaps have some cohesiveness around moving an issue.
Sure.
And that the health issue is important, obviously. We see this happening in real time around some of the social justice issues and violence issues, particularly law enforcement, issues in communities. And I think it's exciting. I think if there's a potential to perhaps study that within the context of a year, within the ACE, and then use that information to perhaps find the appropriate intervention or build the appropriate intervention that could help that, move.
And that's the systems level, that, when you get to a systems level, rather than looking at the individual behavioral outcomes, which ultimately you're interested in, that's a step to it. So
in respect to the other groups, I want them to at least get a few minutes. Any key thoughts?
As you work through identifying what it is your protocol is going to be defined as. Just defining your research question, whether it's systems level or outcomes level. Get the support. It's a great, where you're going is great. You've got the vision, just got to get the detail down, because an IRB can't react without the detail.
And I think once you take a step further in terms of that refinement and feel like, okay, this is the direction I'm going, we can reconvene with me, Brian,
absolutely.
whoever, to take that next step.
Thank you.
All right.
Dr. Steve.
Ours is in a somewhat different state. We're somewhat focused on what we need to do in terms of our IRB submission. Right now, we had a meeting on Monday, and we're going through, and just to recall, our study has to deal with extending the ability to do surveys to kids in Delaware who currently aren't included in the major surveys because they aren't in mainstream classrooms, and to, in a sense, both sort of push the needle in terms of getting better data for Delaware, and maybe push the needle in trying to help the CDC how they could do a better job of sort of surveying more kids than they have been in their surveillance instruments. In the process of that, we're realizing we don't have a good handle even on the actual numbers of disabled kids who are not currently in the classrooms. And we're working with, first of all, the DOE records, and secondly, some of the contacts of the DOE to sort of identify how many kids, we know how many kids have a classification which they call IEP, which means they have a level of basically accommodation that's going to be provided for them in the school systems. Some of those kids are mainstreamed into regular classrooms, others in separate classrooms, others are in separate schools. And it's figuring out sort of what are the different kinds of disabilities that lead to them not being included in the regular classrooms, and what are the kinds of accommodations that we need. So first of all, before we go to the IRB, we're getting a handle on the population, how many they are. The state doesn't even really know. They know sort of district by district, they have these counts, but they can't tell you how many of their people who have these accommodation classifications are mainstreamed into classrooms, into regular classrooms, and how many aren't. So first of all, we're working on a district by district basis to get those numbers together. Then we're going to work with the Disabilities Council and particularly some of the parents involved in that to get their input onto the kinds of issues that they have seen in their activist work with the communities, of the kinds of issues that kids would have that would preclude them from being able to participate, get a sense of that. And probably our initial request, and Maria mentioned that you can have amendments, I think we're probably going to put in a request that will involve sort of dealing with focus groups first, focus groups of staff at the schools that deal with these disabled kids, of the parents of disabled kids, and probably of a group of disabled kids themselves. But that's a little trickier to put together because if we want to have a couple of groups and want them to be representative, we know there are very different kinds of disabilities out there. We're not quite sure how we're going to put that together, whether there will be a focus group for that or whether we may deal on a more individual basis. But we're going to have issues where we won't have probably too much trouble doing staff interviews and even potentially parent interviews, but we will have to have a full board review when we do anything that involves talking to the kids themselves, because we'll have to explain the kinds of kids that we would want to talk to in terms of their levels of comprehension and their individual level, and we'd have to talk about how we're going to reach out to their parents, because what we do know from working with the disabled groups already is some parents really want to have their kids more included in these things. Some parents don't. They just they don't want to have their kids sort of
mocked or
in a sense studied or done anything with. So that in a sense, there are issues here in terms of sort of dealing with the community themselves. And you're talking about the culturally understanding the community. The community itself is not of one voice in this matter. We don't. In some ways, maybe it's easier in a tribal setting where if you have a chief or a tribal council, they can tell you what the community is going to do, or in India. In this case, we have a community of parents who have very different opinions at times, and we have to sort of represent the diversity. And there will be, of course, always when we get to the stage of including more people in the survey, there's always the right of the parents and the kids to decide they don't want to participate in the process. So we have although we've got fairly good idea of what we want to do in some of our research questions, we have a big job in, first of all, defining the population, the scope of the population, and the degrees of and the kinds of disabilities that are involved.
Are you aware if schools have a role or a particular individual that kind of helps and assists in managing the care of these children?
Some districts have people, some individual schools do, some individual schools don't. It's one of the difficulties, of course, in working with Department of Educations are that they're the most feudal sort of social organization we have. We have a Secretary of Education, but we also have sort of basically every district is its own feudal barony, and every sort of school is its own castle.
Right.
But do you? And I would ask, what's the? Are you engaging who in the community will be your partner if you're engaging them, or how is that interaction?
The partners are sort of some of the disabilities community from their perspective, the people, the schools themselves from their perspective, and particularly the staff in the schools who deal with the disabled populations are.
But so far you presented it as they will be providing data.
they'll be providing, well, data in the sense of helping us to understand what are the limits, how many kids they're dealing with. For one thing we very much want to do now is there are wonderful technologies out there. They are probably using a number of these technologies already in terms of doing their own either testing of one kinds for academic things or not. What kinds of methodologies and equipment and sort of new technologies are out there that we could adapt to doing the survey process that are already familiar to the schools. So, yeah.
Just sorry, because we're gonna run out of time. Any like hot issues you want to like point out for him to be working on and considering in advance of writing this protocol.
I think they have a good handle on understanding the challenge with the consent process, depending on which group, and I think it's a good strategy to stratify it and start one at a time.
Yeah.
If you don't need to get to the children yet, and in fact, it makes more sense probably to get to the children already better informed about how to get to them, right? And you're doing that by the interaction with the other populations. I would just, because it's community engaged research, I will be clear when you're defining on who is a subject, who is a partner, and
that's right.
The concept of because so far it's still the classical model to where you're reaching to people and collecting data from how they operate, right, and potentially implementing something you do. I would like to see, and I think it's important for this program, how the benefits for the community, how is that feedback going back, right? And maybe elaborate on that as to play on that community engagement piece. Who is your partner and how are you going back with a benefit to that, regardless of what you publish or not, or how the state benefits. But I think that would be, from my view, looking for that community engagement, or maybe it's not engaged anymore. Maybe it's not, in your case, it's not community driven, it's not community engaged, but maybe it is. I mean, and justify those. I was missing that. I was missing that level of the community partnership.
I just had two hot button issues for me, and I shared one already with you, and that was the rescue plan, especially when you're dealing with kids in different levels of cognitive abilities. Some, for example, Asperger's probably very well could help participate. The second part of that is anonymity. How are you going to manage potentially if there's site challenge? Is somebody going to read them the survey? And then it's no longer an anonymous survey, and how are you going to manage that?
That's right, and that has to do with the different levels of accommodation. Some of which can potentially maintain anonymity if we're dealing with something like the School for the Blind or something like that, but others in which where we're doing a whole school and we just change the route of administration in the way that they could do it versus ones where it needs a one-on-one interaction, in which case confidentiality would become what we would have to offer rather than anonymity.
Well, and if you're not recording, I mean, anonymity, if you are, no matter how much you facilitate the process, right, maybe somebody will get to know who did it, but if there is no record, it's a tricky one. It's like I know your current survey.
We can make it de-identified pretty quickly.
Right.
But there is a group. There's one point there where there's a one-on-one interaction where it's not de-identified. And we just one quick thing to kind of probably say that in that thing, if we're doing something like the YRVS and we got something that indicated suicide, ideation, how would we deal with that?
Well, and I'm thinking too about if it's a child and you're asking me about the bad things like am I smoking and having sex, and this is my regular helper in the classroom. You know what I mean? Like, do I want to share that information with them? Am I going to be honest, about that? And even just maybe in that case, like, it would be hard to say, I'm just not going to answer that question right now. I mean, certainly, that's kind of how we address it.
And one of the reasons we go in there and do it ourselves is so the people in the school aren't asking the questions.
All right, we got to switch. Michael and Sean.
We were looking to improve the quality of physical activity in people with cancer by developing a needs assessment for both the people with cancer and for caregivers. And professional and personal caregivers. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, we had kind of left it loosely in terms of sort of support persons just wanting to be inclusive because they're a big part of the behavior.
Yeah. I mean, I think I hear this all the time from my folks with cancer is during cancer treatment, there's fatigue as the major side effect, and after post-treatment, they're deconditioned from treatment, and there's the activity, increase your activity, but in what way, and how do we do it? So how do we improve that quality by assessing the needs through our participants and through caregivers?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think kind of our objective with this grant is to build from the community so that we have something that it's really a needs assessment in the truest sense to see what's out there, and that'll help us sort of build our subsequent research agenda and programmatically build our subsequent agenda. And really the people that we're looking to talk to is cancer survivors, their support people, service providers. And that's where we sort of get those same levels that everybody else is talking about. And then we have just even at the initial sort of inaugural meeting, we've had a number of people from the state say that they would be interested in providing some feedback too. So I guess our challenges are really around kind of the consenting component again, and then working with these different levels. What we had put forward in our initial proposal was a series of key informant interviews to get the lay of the land, develop sort of our recruitment strategy for who else we were going to talk to, and then to do some focus groups. So that's kind of what we have envisioned right now.
And I don't know if I missed that you're defining the cancer survivors generally, right, or by cancer?
We see, and we specifically hadn't gone by sort of stage or diagnosis or time since treatment, which are kind of the big three in terms of what we look at. Because it could be a radically different experience for someone that's 5 years post versus still on active treatment. It could be different if you've prostate and you're sort of watching weight versus you've had radical
cancer.
Exactly. Yeah. So for us, because it's just lay of the land, we wanted to keep it pretty broad right now. Yeah.
No, that's fine. It's just a matter of.
It's a great question.
I know that the board will say, well, it's not the same, and same thing with the stage. If you're approaching somebody that doesn't have much hope or has been told,
late stage,
right? How you're approaching them and what type of language and all that you're using.
And it's almost like we're doing the research to get at that versus trying to figure it out up front.
And that's where we come. The challenge for the two of us, the IRB and the researcher, is like we understand you have to get to the full definition of your project, but our boards are not used to dealing with much flexibility as to it's like, so I would say whatever steps you are taking clearly defined as broad. I mean, you can keep flexibility and you are going to need a broad range, and you're going to say, well, I'm going to approach different stages and different and if you think a distinction in language is needed or not, for example, knowing the population, or it may just be broad enough. But whatever you're tackling, that can be easily followed as there is range, but we know where the range is and why there is a range. Not just say, as you just told me right now in words, it's like I need flexibility, I need diversity of my group. Yeah. Because my question is still in development, and I don't know how different it will be from group to group, so I don't want to narrow it right now. And just by giving us the justification, I think the board can easily follow your.
I guess that's the challenge I'm having though, because it's not necessarily that the question is in development. It's that development is the question.
Right.
So how do we put that forward in a way that's sort of meaningful to an IRB board
from your design
that we're not fishing, right?
Well, but you are fishing.
Well, but that's possible.
Well, and that's a good thing.
Yeah.
I mean, the idea is that in my mind, and again, this is going to go through you, so I don't want to.
Through our board.
But you have a list of questions that clearly you're going to want to submit as part of this initial protocol as you're developing. And that from that list of questions, potentially you're going to get responses, right? Which you're going to get a script from, and then from that you're going to grow a new protocol.
Right.
Which is what I'm hearing, correct? Is that ultimately the design, the long term, the longitudinal?
I think the longitudinal is whether it's another protocol in terms of an intervention, whether it's one of the things, whether it's we have a better idea in terms of what we could do as a statewide survey, and then for us really, for Sean as a programmer, what are some programs that we could be incorporating that are going to address these needs?
Right, but this is part A.
Exactly.
This is part A, and part A is going to have a series of focus groups or interviews, and that's how you're going to approach it as a qualitative data study to the IRB with in here.